The smell is what I remember first. Not the rot that came later. Not the copper and ash stink of the cities burning on the horizon. Before all of that, there was the smell of old water on limestone. Cold air pushing out of a hole in the mountainside, like the earth itself was exhaling. I stood at the entrance of that tunnel on a Tuesday afternoon, 7 days before the world ended, and I breathed it in like it meant something. It did. I just didn't know it yet. My name is Ethan Marsh. I was 36 years old, a surveyor for the county transportation office, and I had been sent to assess the structural integrity of an abandoned rail tunnel in the Appalachian Ridge above Calvary, West Virginia. The tunnel had been out of service since 1971. The rail company that built it went bankrupt in the 80s. The state acquired the land, forgot about it, and then someone in the governor's office decided they wanted to convert old rail corridors into hiking trails. So they sent me. I parked my truck at the end of a fire road that had been chewed apart by runoff. Hiked 40 minutes through second-growth hardwood. Found the portal exactly where the 1968 survey maps said it would be a stone arch entrance set into a wall of rhododendron and shale, partially obscured by decades of kudzu. The iron rails were still visible, rusted the color of dried blood, disappearing into the dark. I turned on my headlamp and walked in. The tunnel ran straight for roughly 2,000 feet before curving gently to the southeast. I noted the construction. Hand-cut stone lining for the first 300 feet, then poured concrete in good condition, then bare rock where the tunnel had been bored through solid sandstone. The ceiling was 12 feet at its peak. The walls were dry in most places. There were 2 alcoves, old equipment niches carved into the walls at roughly the quarter and halfway marks. The air temperature held steady at 54 degrees. It was, by any professional standard, remarkably sound. 53 years of abandonment, and the mountain had barely touched it. I filed my report that evening. Structurally viable, recommended for trail conversion with minor remediation. I attached photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates. I emailed it to my supervisor, and I didn't think about the tunnel again for 3 days. On Friday, I came home from work, and my wife, Nora, was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, and a look on her face I hadn't seen since her mother's diagnosis. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the moment before fear, when the body understands before the mind catches up. "Ethan," she said, "come look at this." The videos were grainy, most of them filmed on phones, most of them from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I'd seen fragments on social media earlier that week. Everyone had, but I'd done what most people did. I assumed exaggeration. I assumed context I wasn't seeing. The human mind is exceptional at building walls around information it doesn't want to process. Nora had torn those walls down. She'd spent the entire day cross-referencing sources, pulling reports from the WHO, the CDC, the European Center for Disease Prevention. She'd found the flight manifests someone had leaked on a medical forum. She'd mapped the spread. "It's not staying over there," she said quietly. Our daughter, Lily, was upstairs doing homework. She was 11. She'd asked about the news at dinner the night before, and I'd told her it was like the flu scary on TV, manageable in real life. I'd believed it when I said it. "How long?" I asked. "The incubation period is between 18 and 40 hours. Based on the flight data, there are already carriers in at least 12 U.S. cities." She turned the laptop toward me. "Atlanta, Chicago, Denver. The containment language the CDC is using, Ethan. It's the same language they used internally before they acknowledged community spread during COVID. Except this is faster. And the neurological component. I saw the videos. Then you saw what they do. I had. The movement. The way the infected turned rigid before they turned violent. The jaw distension. The sound, the kind of wet percussive clicking that I could hear even through the terrible audio compression of a cell phone video. I told myself it was staged. Some kind of viral marketing for a movie. Nora wasn't a survivalist. She wasn't prone to conspiracy thinking. She was a former epidemiologist who'd left research to teach high school biology because the grant cycle was destroying her health. When she said something was real, it was real. "I need you to hear me," she said. "We have days, not weeks." I sat down across from her. The house was quiet. I could hear Lily's music playing faintly through the ceiling. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the tree line, and the sound was so ordinary it felt like a rebuke. "The tunnel," I said. Nora looked at me. "I surveyed a tunnel on Tuesday, old rail tunnel, up in the ridge above Calvary. It's structurally sound, deep in the mountain, single point of entry. If you're right, if this is what you think it is, there are worse places to be." She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions about comfort or plausibility or whether I'd lost my mind. She closed her laptop and said, "Tell me everything about it." That was the moment. Not when the infected reached our county, not when the sirens started. The moment my life divided into before and after was my wife closing a laptop in our kitchen and choosing to believe the world was ending. Saturday morning, I drove back to the tunnel alone. I told Nora I needed to reassess it with different eyes, not as a surveyor measuring wall integrity, but as someone measuring whether the space could keep 3 people alive. The fire road was empty. No hikers, no vehicles. The trailhead parking area was just a wide spot in the gravel with a shot-up Forest Service sign. I loaded my pack with things I hadn't brought on Tuesday. A tape measure, a battery lantern, a notebook, and a 9mm pistol I kept in a lockbox under the bed. I'd owned the gun for 8 years and fired it recreationally maybe a dozen times. Strapping it to my hip felt performative, almost embarrassing. But Nora's data was still turning in my head like a stone in a current. The hike-in felt different. The woods were the same oak, maple, poplar, the understory thick with fern and deadfall, but I was reading them differently now. I was thinking about sight lines, cover, how sound carried in the hollow. I reached the tunnel portal at 9:30. Stood at the entrance and let the cold air wash over me. Then I went inside with the lantern held high, and I stopped being a surveyor. The first equipment niche was roughly 500 feet in. It measured 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 9 feet tall, carved directly into the sandstone wall. The floor was level. The stone was dry. It could hold supplies. The second niche, another 500 feet deeper, was slightly smaller but similarly constructed. Beyond the curve, the tunnel ran straight for another 800 feet before ending in a partial collapse where the mountain had reclaimed the bore. The collapse was old, stable, compacted earth and stone. No draft came through it. The tunnel was effectively a dead end. One way in, one way out. I spent 3 hours inside. I measured the alcoves. I tested the floor for pooling water. I checked the ceiling for fractures, the walls for seepage. I walked the full length twice, marking distances with chalk. I found a shallow drainage channel cut into the floor original construction, designed to direct groundwater toward the entrance. It still worked. A thin ribbon of water moved along it, barely visible, cold and clear. Water, shelter, concealment. A choke point that could be defended. I sat in the second alcove with my lantern off and listened to the silence. It was total. Not the silence of a quiet room, where you can still hear the hum of electricity, the settling of a house. This was geological silence. The weight of 1,000,000 tons of stone pressing sound into nothing. I turned the lantern back on and opened my notebook. I made 3 lists. The first was structural, what needed to be reinforced, sealed, or modified. The portal itself was the vulnerability, 12 feet wide, 10 feet tall, fully open. I needed a barrier, something that could be closed, locked, and defended. The second list was supply-based: food, water purification, medical supplies, fuel for light and heat, sanitation. I calculated for 3 people, 30 days minimum. The numbers were staggering, but not impossible. The third list was the one that made my hand shake slightly as I wrote it. People: Nora, Lily. That was fixed. But my brother Dean lived 40 minutes south in Beckley. He had a wife, Sandra, and a 13-year-old son, Marcus. My mother was in an assisted living facility in Lewisburg. Nora's parents were in Richmond, 4 hours away on a good day, longer if the highways locked up. I stared at the list. The alcoves could hold supplies. The main tunnel bore was spacious enough for a temporary camp. But space wasn't the only constraint. Every person added was more food consumed, more water needed, more noise generated, more variables in a crisis. I crossed out nothing. I wrote no names off the list. But I felt the calculation forming in the back of my mind, like something cold taking shape. And I hated myself for it. When I emerged from the tunnel, the daylight was blinding. I stood at the portal blinking, breathing mountain air, feeling like I'd surfaced from deep water. My phone, which had no signal inside the tunnel, buzzed with 17 notifications. 3 were from Nora. The WHO had declared a global health emergency. Domestic flights were being suspended. The governor of Virginia had activated the National Guard. The 4th was from my brother Dean. It read, "You seeing this? What the hell is happening?" I called him from the truck on the drive home. The call connected on the 3rd try. The networks were already straining. "Dean, listen to me carefully. Ethan, Sandra's freaking out. The news is saying, I know what the news is saying. I need you to stop watching the news and start packing." Silence on the line. Dean was 2 years younger than me. He'd done 4 years in the Army, worked construction, built a decent life in Beckley. He was steady in the way men are steady when they've never had to face something that doesn't respond to steadiness. "Packing for what?" he asked. "I found a place, up in the ridge above Calvary. A tunnel, old railroad tunnel, deep in the mountain. It's sound, it's hidden, and it's got one entrance we can seal. I'm going to stock it. I need you to bring your family and meet me there." "Ethan, you're talking like a crazy person." "Yeah," I said. "I know how I sound, but Nora's been tracking this since Wednesday. She used to do this for a living, Dean, and she's scared. She doesn't scare." Another silence. I could hear Sandra in the background asking who was on the phone. "When?" Dean said finally. "Tuesday at the latest. Sooner if things accelerate." "What about Mom?" The question I'd been running from since I wrote her name in the notebook. "Our mother, June Marsh, 71 years old, early-stage vascular dementia, living in a facility that employed compassionate people who were not going to stay at their posts when the world started screaming. I'm going to get her," I said, "tomorrow." Sunday was the last normal day. I know that now with the clarity of hindsight. But even then, moving through it, I could feel the texture of the hours changing. The grocery store was busier than usual, but not panicked. People were buying water and canned goods with a kind of self-conscious awkwardness, as if embarrassed to be seen preparing for something that might not happen. I filled 2 carts. Rice, beans, canned vegetables, canned fruit, peanut butter, powdered milk, salt, sugar, cooking oil. I paid with a credit card that still worked and loaded the bags into my truck under a sky that was absurdly, offensively blue. Nora stayed home and packed differently. She approached our house like a problem to be triaged. Medications first. She pulled everything from the bathroom cabinet, sorted it, added what she could from the first aid kit I kept in the garage. Then clothing, thermal layers, rain gear, sturdy boots for 3. Then tools. Then the camping equipment we hadn't used since Lily was 7. She worked with a controlled intensity that frightened me more than anything on the news because it meant she'd already accepted the premise. Lily knew something was wrong. She stood in the hallway, watching her mother empty closets, and said, "Are we going somewhere?" Nora knelt down and took her hands. "Dad found a safe place in the mountains. We're going to go stay there for a while, like camping. It's going to be an adventure." "Because of the sick people on the news?" "Yes, baby. Because of that." "Emma's mom said it's just in other countries." "Emma's mom might be right," Nora said carefully. "But Dad and I want to be extra careful. You know how I always say, better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." Nora smiled, and the smile was so precisely calibrated to look reassuring that it broke something in my chest. Exactly. I drove to Lewisburg that afternoon to see my mother. The assisted living facility was operating normally, staff at the desk, residents in the common room watching television. The television was showing footage from Philadelphia. A highway overpass packed with cars that weren't moving. Dark shapes moving between the vehicles. The staff had turned the volume down, but not off. My mother was in her room, sitting by the window. She had good days and difficult days, and this was somewhere in between. She recognized me immediately, smiled, called me by name. But when I told her I wanted to take her on a trip, she looked confused. "A trip where?" "Up into the mountains, Mom. Just for a few days. A little family getaway." "Is Dean coming?" "Dean's coming. Sandra and Marcus too. And Nora and Lily." She brightened at Lily's name. She always brightened at Lily's name. Well, if Lily's going, I suppose I'd better go too. The facility required a sign-out process. I spoke with the charge nurse, a woman named Patrice, and told her I was taking my mother for a family visit. Patrice looked at me with eyes that said she'd been watching the same television we'd all been watching. "How long will she be gone?" Patrice asked. "I'm not sure." Patrice nodded slowly. "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to be honest with you. We've had 6 families come in today to pick up residents. If things get worse, we're going to be short-staffed. Your mother's medications, I'll print her full list. Make sure you have refills." She printed the list. She handed it to me. Then she said quietly, "You're doing the right thing." I drove my mother back to our house. She sat in the passenger seat watching the mountains pass and humming a song I didn't recognize. She didn't ask about the news. She didn't ask why the pharmacy was crowded when I stopped to fill her prescriptions, or why I bought the maximum allowed quantity of everything on her list. That evening, the 5 of us, Nora, Lily, my mother, and me, ate dinner at our kitchen table. Nora had made pot roast because we had a roast that would go to waste otherwise, and it felt important to use what we had. The meal was quiet. Lily talked about a book she was reading. My mother complimented the potatoes. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking again, but this time it didn't stop. And after 20 minutes, the barking turned to whimpering, and then silence. I went to the window. The neighbor's house was dark. Their car was gone. They left Nora said from behind me. She'd already noticed. About an hour ago. Packed their car and drove south. I looked at the empty driveway. The porch light was still on, burning for no one. We leave tomorrow, I said. First light. Before bed, I went to the garage and loaded the truck. I worked for 3 hours, packing methodically, fitting supplies into every available space. When I finished, I stood in the garage and called Dean. Monday morning, I told him. Fire road off Route 16, past the Calvary Church. Look for my truck. Bring everything you can carry. Food, water, tools, warm clothing. And Dean, bring the generator. The small one. Ethan. His voice was different now. Tighter. There are cases in Charleston. I know. Marcus is scared. I know. Get here tomorrow. I hung up and stood in the silence of my garage, surrounded by the organized evidence of my own fear. The shelves where I kept paint cans and old tax returns were half empty. The camping gear was gone. The gun safe was open. The 9mm already in the truck. Only the shotgun remained, and I took that too. I checked the locks on every door. I looked in on Lily, who was asleep with her book still open on her chest. I looked in on my mother, who was asleep with a lamp on, her face slack and peaceful. Then I went to bed and lay beside Nora in the dark. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too. I keep thinking about my parents. Nora's parents, Richmond. 4 hours, I'd called them that morning. Her father had laughed and told me to stop watching the news. Her mother had said they were fine. They had plenty of food. The neighborhood was quiet. We can't make them come, I said. I know. If things get bad, we'll try again. I know. She turned toward me. Her hand found mine in the dark. The tunnel is enough. The tunnel is enough. I said it with a conviction I manufactured from nothing. And she accepted it because the alternative was unbearable. And we lay there listening to the house settle around us, while somewhere east, in cities we'd never visit again, the clicking had already begun. Monday morning came gray and cold. October in the Appalachian Ridge, the trees were turning. The air had that metallic bite that precedes the first hard frost. I had the truck loaded and the engine running by 6. Nora moved through the house doing a final sweep, and I watched her pause in the living room, her hand on the back of Lily's favorite chair, and I understood she was saying goodbye to our home, without saying it aloud. My mother was confused by the early hour, but cooperative. Lily was quiet, clutching a backpack she'd packed herself books, a stuffed animal she pretended she was too old for, a flashlight. She climbed into the back seat without complaint and buckled in beside her grandmother. We were on the fire road by 7:15. The drive up was rough. The truck bottomed out twice on the washed-out sections, and I heard supplies shifting in the bed. Nora navigated from the passenger seat using the topo maps I'd printed. We parked at the wide spot, and I killed the engine. The forest was still. No birds. I noticed this and said nothing. The hike to the tunnel portal was 40 minutes for me alone. With Nora, Lily, and my mother, it took an hour and 20. My mother moved slowly but without complaint, using a walking stick I'd cut for her from a fallen branch. Lily stayed close to her grandmother, holding her elbow on the steep sections. Nora carried 2 packs and set a pace that balanced urgency with what my mother's body could sustain. When we reached the tunnel entrance, Lily stopped. "It's dark," she said. "It gets better inside," I told her. "I've got lanterns." "It smells like rocks." "That's because it's inside a mountain. Mountains smell like rocks." She looked at me with an expression that was pure 11-year-old skepticism. "That's not reassuring, Dad." I laughed. It was the last time I laughed easily for a long time. I'd made 3 trips the previous afternoon while Nora packed the house, ferrying supplies from the truck to the tunnel on a handcart I'd rigged from a garden wagon and reinforced wheels. The first alcove was already stacked with food containers, water jugs, and equipment, but the bulk of our supplies were still in the truck, and there was no road to the tunnel. Everything had to be carried. I was making my second carry of the morning, sweating through my jacket on the trail, when I heard the engine. Dean's truck appeared around the bend in the fire road, moving faster than the surface warranted. He parked behind mine and the doors opened, and Dean stepped out looking like he hadn't slept. Sandra was next, a small, fierce woman who'd grown up on a farm outside Hinton and carried herself with the particular toughness of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life. She was already pulling packs from the truck bed before Dean had finished closing his door. Marcus came last, headphones around his neck, his eyes wide and wary. He was 13 and tall for his age, with his mother's dark hair and his father's heavy build. "How bad is the road up?" Dean asked, scanning the tree line. "Bad. Park as far off the fire road as you can. We'll cover the trucks with brush later." "Later? We should—" "Dean, the tunnel first, then the trucks." He looked at me. He wanted to argue. Dean always wanted to argue. It was how he processed stress, but something in my face stopped him. He nodded once and started unloading. It took the 6 of us 7, with my mother doing what she could until mid-afternoon, to move everything from both trucks to the tunnel. Dean had brought the generator, a full toolbox, extra fuel, a camp stove, and a quantity of canned food that suggested Sandra had been preparing longer than Dean had admitted. She'd also brought medical supplies, a sewing kit, and 3 wool blankets that she'd taken from her grandmother's cedar chest. "Those are hand-loomed," she said when she caught me looking. "They'll last longer than anything you bought at a store." We established camp in the main tunnel bore, roughly 600 feet from the entrance past the first alcove, but before the curve. Dean and I rigged the lanterns along the walls. Nora organized supplies with a system she'd devised on the drive. Sandra set up sleeping areas. Marcus and Lily were given the job of filling water containers from the drainage channel, and they did it without complaint, working together with the cautious politeness of cousins who saw each other mainly at holidays. My mother sat on a folding chair in the first alcove and watched the entrance. She hadn't said much all day, but she'd kept pace, and she hadn't asked difficult questions. I brought her a cup of water, and she took my hand. "Ethan," she said, "this is about those sick people, isn't it?" "Yes, Mom." She nodded. "Your father would have done the same thing, found a hole in the ground and put his family in it." She squeezed my hand. "He would have been right too." My father died in 2019. A heart attack on a Sunday morning, quick and final. He'd been a coal miner for 30 years. He knew tunnels. He would have understood this one. By 5 o'clock, the camp was functional. Dean and I walked back to the entrance and stood at the portal, looking out at the dimming forest. The silence was still wrong, too empty, too absolute. "I haven't heard a bird all day," Dean said. "Neither have I." The radio in the truck. On the drive up, I was scanning stations. Half of them are off the air, the ones still broadcasting. He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "Ethan, they're saying the National Guard pulled out of Charleston. Just left. There are fires." "I know. You keep saying that." I know. "What's the plan for this?" He gestured at the tunnel entrance. "We can't just leave it open." "No, we can't." The plan had been forming since Saturday. I'd spent the drive up finalizing it in my head. The entrance was 12 feet wide and 10 feet tall. We couldn't brick it up. We didn't have the materials or the time. But Dean had brought lumber. I had tools. And the tunnel itself offered something most shelters didn't. A natural choke point with stone walls on every side. We started building the barrier that evening. Dean and I worked by lantern light while the others slept or tried to sleep. The plan was a double-layered barricade, an outer wall of stacked stone and earth reinforced with lumber framing, and an inner gate that could be opened and closed. The materials came from the tunnel itself and the surrounding forest. We pulled loose stone from the rubble at the collapsed end. We cut timber from deadfall near the entrance. Dean worked with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 15 years framing houses, and I followed his lead, holding boards while he drove screws, mixing a crude morite from mud and gravel to fill gaps in the stone. By 2 a.m, the outer wall was waist-high. By dawn, it reached the ceiling. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't engineered. But it was 4 feet thick at its base, tapering to 2 feet at the top. And the gate, a reinforced wooden frame set into the stone, could be barred from the inside with 2x6 lumber soldered into iron brackets Dean had fabricated from scrap. We left a gap at the top for ventilation, roughly 18 inches between the wall and the ceiling. Air still flowed through, carrying the mountain cold inward. It would also carry sound. That was a trade-off I noted and accepted. Sandra appeared at first light with coffee heated on the camp stove. She studied the barricade with her arms crossed. That'll hold against what exactly? Dean glanced at me. I took the coffee. It doesn't need to hold against a siege. It needs to keep out anything that's not thinking clearly enough to operate a gate. And if what's out there is thinking clearly, then we have other problems. She held my gaze for a moment, then turned and walked back to camp. Sandra had a way of asking questions that weren't really questions, they were pressure tests. And if your answer didn't hold, she remembered. The barricade changed the tunnel. With the gate closed, the darkness became absolute, except for our lanterns. The sound changed too, our voices flattened, absorbed by the stone and the wall. Lily noticed immediately. "It sounds like being inside a shell," she said. "A shell? Like a seashell, but backwards. The sound goes in instead of out." She was right. The tunnel swallowed sound. From the barricade inward, we existed in a pocket of compressed quiet where every footstep, every whisper, every clink of a spoon against a can was intimate and inescapable. It would, over the coming days, become both our protection and our pressure. That was Tuesday, day 1 inside. I set up a schedule immediately. Water collection twice daily from the drainage channel. Meals at fixed times to conserve supplies and maintain psychological rhythm. Lantern rationing, 1 lit at all times in the main camp area. Others used only as needed. Generator reserved for charging the battery-powered radio and the 2 phones we'd kept, though neither phone had signal inside the mountain. Dean took over security. He positioned himself near the barricade for the first watch, shotgun across his knees, and I saw something settle in his posture, a familiarity, a competence. The Army had given Dean structure, and structure was what he reached for when the ground shifted. Nora organized a medical station in the second alcove. She inventoried every pill, every bandage, every tube of antibiotic ointment. She made a chart of my mother's medications and taped it to the wall. She showed Sandra where everything was. "If something happens to me," she said, "you need to be able to manage June's care." Sandra looked at her. "Nothing's going to happen to you. I'm making contingency plans, that's all. It's day 1, Nora." which is exactly when you make contingency plans. They were alike in some ways: practical, direct, intolerant of inefficiency. But where Nora processed threat through information and systems, Sandra processed it through physical readiness. She'd already inventoried the tools, organized the fuel supply, and established a sanitation protocol for the area we'd designated as a latrine, a natural depression in the tunnel floor near the collapsed end, far from camp, covered with lime that Sandra had thought to bring. Marcus and Lily circled each other warily for the first few hours, then settled into an uneasy alliance. Marcus was quiet and watchful, the kind of teenager who observed more than he spoke. Lily was more verbal, more openly anxious, and she filled silence with questions that Marcus answered with careful brevity. "Do you think the sick people will come up here?" Lily asked. "I don't know," Marcus said. "Dad says the tunnel is safe." "My dad says that too. Do you believe him?" Marcus paused. He was arranging batteries by size in a plastic bin, his movements precise. "I believe they're trying," he said. It was the most diplomatic thing I'd ever heard a 13-year-old say, and it told me that Marcus understood more than anyone was telling him. That evening, I took the radio to the barricade and tried to pick up a signal. The stone blocked almost everything, but with the antenna pressed against the gap at the top of the wall, I caught fragments. A station out of Roanoke, cutting in and out. The announcer's voice was strained, professional veneer cracking at the edges. "Advised to shelter in place. Do not attempt to travel. Interstate 64 is closed in both directions. Reports of static. Military operations in the greater Richmond area. Residents are static. Not approach individuals displaying signs of infection. Repeat, do not." Richmond. Nora's parents were in Richmond. I turned off the radio and sat in the dark behind the wall we'd built and listened to the mountain breathe through the gap above my head. Somewhere out in that breathing darkness, beyond the trees and the ridgeline and the valleys below, the world was tearing itself apart. The barricade held the night back, but it couldn't hold back what was coming. Wednesday, day 2. I woke to the sound of my mother talking to someone who wasn't there. She was sitting upright on her cot, speaking in a low, conversational tone, her eyes focused on the middle distance. Nora was already beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "June, it's morning. You're in the tunnel, remember? With Ethan and Lily." My mother blinked, looked at Nora, then at me. "I was talking to Ray." Ray, my father, dead 6 years. "I know," Nora said gently. "But Ray isn't here right now. Can I get you some water?" The dementia was mild most days. Small confusions, repeated questions, occasional gaps in the timeline. But stress accelerated it. The unfamiliar environment, the cold, the darkness that never fully lifted, even with the lanterns, it was pressing on the cracks in her cognition. I added this to the list of things I was carrying and said nothing. By mid-morning, Dean and I agreed we needed to scout the immediate area around the tunnel entrance. The barricade was solid, but we had no visibility, no way of knowing what was happening in the forest beyond the portal. I proposed a short patrol, down to the trucks to check for disturbances, a loop through the nearby tree line, then back. We opened the gate. The daylight through the portal was gray and flat. Rain had come overnight, and the forest floor was dark with it. We moved quietly. Dean led, shotgun up, scanning in arcs the way he'd been trained. I followed with the pistol, feeling acutely aware of my lack of training, my civilian softness. The trail to the trucks was undisturbed. Both vehicles were where we'd left them, partially concealed by the brush we'd piled over them. No tracks, no sounds. We circled wider. Dean pointed at the ground near a fallen oak deer tracks. Fresh, heading downslope. Normal. We kept moving. Then Dean stopped. He held up a fist, the military hand signal for halt, and I froze. He was looking at something ahead, through a gap in the rhododendron. I followed his gaze. A person, standing in the hollow below us, maybe 60 yards out. A man, wearing a dark jacket, facing away from us. He was motionless, not walking, not looking around, just standing in the rain-soaked forest like a piece of furniture someone had placed there and forgotten. Dean raised the shotgun to his shoulder. I put my hand on his arm. "Wait," I breathed. We watched. 30 seconds. 60. The figure didn't move. Didn't shift weight, didn't turn, didn't react to the rain dripping from the canopy above. There was something wrong with his posture, a rigidity in the spine. The head canted slightly to one side, as if listening to a frequency we couldn't hear. Then the clicking started. It was faint at that distance, but unmistakable. The same sound from the videos, a rapid, wet percussion, like someone snapping their jaw open and closed with mechanical regularity. It carried through the wet air with a sickening clarity. Dean's finger moved to the trigger guard. I tightened my grip on his arm. "We go back," I whispered. Now, quietly. We backed away. 10 feet, 20. The figure didn't turn, didn't react. We retraced our path to the tunnel portal, moving with a care that turned every footstep into a negotiation with the ground. Inside, I pulled the gate shut, and Dean barred it. We stood behind the wall, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the chemical dump of adrenaline, the body's ancient recognition of predation. "That was one," Dean said. "One. Where there's one, I know." Sandra appeared from the camp. She read our faces instantly. "What happened?" "We saw one," Dean said, "in the hollow below the trail, 60 yards from the tunnel." Sandra's hand went to her stomach, an unconscious gesture I'd seen before, a woman protecting her center. "Is it coming this way?" "It wasn't moving at all," I said. "It was just standing there." Standing? Like it was waiting. That word, waiting, changed the air inside the tunnel. It introduced something I hadn't accounted for in my lists and calculations. I'd imagined the infected as chaotic, driven, a force of mindless momentum. The videos had shown running, swarming, violence. They hadn't shown stillness. They hadn't shown patience. If the infected could be patient, the barricade wasn't a wall. It was a starting point. Nora found me in the first alcove an hour later. I was repacking supplies, more for the need to use my hands than any logistical purpose. "How close?" she asked. "Close enough." "Ethan, how close?" 2-minute walk from the entrance, maybe less. She sat down on a supply crate. In the lantern light, her face was all planes and shadows. She looked older than 34. We all did. "I tried the radio again," she said. "I got a station out of Bluefield. They're saying the infection has reached every state. Federal response has collapsed. The emergency broadcast system is running on a loop shelter in place. Await further instructions." But there are no further instructions. "What about Richmond?" She shook her head. Once sharp. The conversation about her parents was a door she'd closed, and I understood not to open it again. Not yet. Not until she was ready. "We need to reinforce the barricade," I said. "With what?" "More stone, more earth. I want it thick enough that nothing short of heavy machinery gets through." "And the ventilation gap?" I'd been thinking about this. The gap was necessary without it. The air quality in the tunnel would deteriorate dangerously. But it was also a weakness. 18 inches of open space. We screen it. Dean's got wire mesh in his truck. He uses it for concrete work. We fix it across the gap, secure it with bolts driven into the stone. It won't stop a determined person. But the infected we saw, it wasn't using tools. It wasn't thinking in a way that would include dismantling a screen. Nora nodded slowly. And if they start thinking that way, then we deal with that when it happens. It wasn't a good answer. She knew it. I knew it. But the tunnel was what we had, and the barricade was what stood between us and the clicking thing in the hollow, and we would improve it because the alternative was paralysis. Dean and I spent the rest of the day reinforcing. We pulled stone until our hands bled. We packed earth into every gap. We mounted the wire mesh across the ventilation gap with bolts I hammered into the sandstone, using a masonry bit and a hand drill. By nightfall, the barricade was 6 feet thick at the base, a fortress wall built by 2 men in a tunnel mortared with mud and fear. I stood behind it and listened. The clicking was gone. The forest beyond the wall offered nothing but silence. But silence, I was learning, meant nothing at all. Thursday, day 3. Routine became religion. Dean woke at 5 for the first watch. I relieved him at 9. Sandra prepared meals, cold breakfasts, heated lunches, and dinners with an efficiency that spoke to years of feeding people on schedules. Nora managed my mother's medications, checked everyone's health, and maintained the supply inventory with daily updates written on a sheet of paper taped to the alcove wall. Marcus and Lily handled water duty, waste management, and the small maintenance tasks that accumulated in a tunnel camp, relighting lanterns, sweeping grit from sleeping areas, checking for water seepage after rain. The rhythm was stabilizing. That should have been comforting. Instead, it exposed the fractures. On Thursday afternoon, Dean and Sandra had their first fight. I heard it from the main camp, not the words, which they kept low, but the cadence. The sharp exchange of sentences like stones thrown in sequence. Marcus sat with his back against the tunnel wall, headphones on, eyes closed, his stillness so practiced it looked like a survival skill all its own. Later, Sandra came to the water station where I was filtering drainage water through our gravity filter. Her jaw was tight. "He wants to go back down to the trucks," she said. "Why?" "The radio in his truck has a CB band. He thinks he can reach someone, other survivors, military, anyone. He wants information. Going outside is a risk." That's what I told him. She filled a water bottle with controlled movements. "He said staying inside with no information is a bigger risk. He said we're blind in here and blind people die. He's not wrong about the information. He's wrong about the risk calculation." She looked at me directly. "You saw that thing in the hollow. One of them, standing there like it was plugged into the ground. If there are more, if they're in the trees between here and the trucks, Dean walks into that with a shotgun and a hero complex, and Marcus grows up without a father." The naked terror in her voice was more convincing than any argument I could construct. But Dean wasn't wrong either. We were operating on 2-day-old radio fragments and observations from a single, brief patrol. The world outside our wall was a blank space filling with our worst projections. I found Dean at the barricade. He was sitting on the stone shelf we'd built as a watch position, the shotgun across his lap, a lantern at low burn beside him. "Sandra talked to you," he said. "She's scared." "We're all scared. That's not a strategy." He shifted the shotgun. "Ethan, I'm not proposing a road trip. I want to get to the trucks, try the CB, and come back. 30 minutes. We go together, tomorrow morning, early before full light. We move fast, we stay quiet, and at the first sign of anything, we come back." He considered this. "Both of us? Who watches the gate? Sandra knows how to bar it from inside. And Nora? I hesitated. Nora can use the pistol. I'll leave it with her. Dean studied me. In the low light, his face was a map of the same genetics I saw in my own mirrors. Same jaw, same deep-set eyes, same tendency to carry tension in the shoulders. All right, he said. Tomorrow. That night, I sat with Lily while she tried to sleep. The tunnel cold had settled into her sleeping bag, and she shivered in small, rhythmic pulses. I zipped her tighter and sat beside her with my hand on her back. Dad? Yeah? What happens if we run out of food? The question hit a structural wall in my mind, a place where I'd built careful projections and known they were insufficient. Our supplies, rationed carefully, would last 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we cut portions. After that, someone would have to leave the tunnel. We have plenty of food, I said. But what if we didn't? Then I'd go find more. Outside? Yes. Where the sick people are. Lily, listen to me. My job, my only job, is to make sure you and Mom and Grandma and everyone else in this tunnel are safe and fed. I'm going to do that job, okay? She was quiet for a long time. Then, Marcus says the sick people can hear really well. He says they hunt by sound. I made a note to have a conversation with Marcus about information management. Marcus doesn't know that for sure. Nobody knows exactly how they work yet. But what if he's right? Then we stay very, very quiet. She turned over in her sleeping bag. Her face in the lantern light was so young, so unmarked by the world I'd brought her into, that I felt the full weight of every decision I'd made settle on my chest like a physical load. Dad? Yeah? I'm glad you found this place. I stayed beside her until her breathing evened out. Then I went to the barricade and sat in the dark and did not sleep. Friday, day 4. Dean and I left the tunnel at 5:30 in the morning. The sky was pre-dawn gray, the forest soaked from overnight fog. I carried the pistol. Dean carried the shotgun. We moved in silence down the trail to the trucks. The hollow where we'd seen the figure on Wednesday was empty. No tracks that I could identify, but the rain had been steady and the ground was churned with runoff. We reached the trucks without incident. Dean's CB radio powered on without issue. He scanned channels methodically, working through the bands with the focused patience of someone who'd used military communications. Most channels were dead. A few carried static. On Channel 9, the emergency band, we caught a recorded loop. This is the emergency alert system. Shelter in place. Do not travel. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Military evacuation points have been established at... The list of locations followed. But the transmission broke apart. The signal weakened by distance and terrain. Those evacuation points, Dean said. Half of them are cities. If the cities are gone, try other channels. He kept scanning. On Channel 14, we found a voice. Live, human. A man, speaking with the clipped cadence of someone who'd been talking into a radio for hours without response. Anyone receiving, this is Frank Hadley, former volunteer fire department, broadcasting from Miller's Ridge, approximately 8 miles southeast of Calvary. We have a group of 11, including 4 children. We are fortified in the fire station, but supplies are low. If anyone can hear this. Dean grabbed the handset. Frank, this is Dean Marsh. We receive you. We're in the ridge above Calvary. Silence. Then, Jesus Christ. Someone's out there. How are you situated? Not good. The fire station's got concrete walls, but the windows are plate glass. We boarded them, but they keep testing the boards. Every night they come down from the ridge and they push against the boards, and they make that goddamn sound. How many infected? Hard to count. Dozens. They move in groups. During the day they're scattered. Some of them just stand in the trees like they're sleeping standing up. But at night, they come together. They move toward sound, toward light. We've been running dark after sundown, but we've got kids, and kids make noise. Dean looked at me. I shook my head slightly. Frank, what do you need? Everything. Food, medicine, ammunition. But mostly we need a way out. If you've got vehicles. Our vehicles are parked, but the roads are dangerous. We're sheltered in a tunnel in the ridge. A tunnel. Old railroad tunnel. Stone walls, single entrance, sealed. A long pause. When Frank spoke again, his voice had changed. A desperate hope had entered it, raw and unmistakable. Can you take us? 11 people. We'll bring what we have. We can move fast. Dean's eyes met mine. In them, I saw the same calculation I'd done in my notebook space. Supplies, sustainability. 11 people. Our supplies were calculated for 7, for 3 to 4 weeks. Add 11, and that timeline collapsed to days. But they had 4 children. Frank, hold this channel. I need to discuss with my group. Don't take long. They get active at dusk. We drove back, actually drove, risking the engine noise for speed. Inside the tunnel, I called everyone together. I laid it out plain. 11 people, 8 miles away, in a position that won't hold. 4 children. They're asking to come here. Sandra spoke first. Our food won't last. No, it won't. Not for 18. Then the answer is no. Sandra, Dean started. Don't. I know what you're going to say. I know there are children. I have a child. He's standing right there. She pointed at Marcus, who stood at the edge of the group, watching. My job is to keep him alive, not to keep strangers alive at his expense. Nora said, they might have supplies of their own. Frank said they'd bring what they have. What does a fire station have? An axe? A hose? Sandra. Dean's voice was quiet, hard. There are 4 kids in a building with plate glass windows and infected pushing against them every night. And if we open that gate for 11 people, we expose this tunnel. We show the way. Every infected between here and that fire station follows them straight to us. The tunnel was silent. My mother sat on her chair watching. Lily pressed against Nora's side. Marcus stood alone, arms crossed, his face unreadable. We can't take them all, I said. The words tasted like metal. But we can't do nothing. Dean and I will go to the fire station. We'll assess. If they can move safely, we'll guide them part way, show them the fire road, give them a direction. But we can't lead them to the tunnel. Then what good does that do? Dean asked. We give them information, maybe some supplies. We tell them what we know about how the infected move, where we've seen them. It's not enough, but it's something. Something, Dean repeated. He looked at the ceiling. We're sitting in a mountain with enough room for 50 people, and we're talking about giving them information. I'm talking about keeping the 7 people in this tunnel alive. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd heard since we sealed the entrance. Dean didn't look at me. Sandra turned and walked back to camp. Nora held Lily and said nothing. Marcus spoke. They're going to die, aren't they? No one answered him. The lantern hissed softly, burning fuel we couldn't replace. I went to the barricade. I pressed my forehead against the cold stone and breathed. Then I went back to Dean and said, Tomorrow morning, we drive to the fire station. We assess, and then we decide. He nodded. It was the kind of nod that holds everything a person can't say. We never made it to the fire station. Saturday morning, day 5. Dean and I were preparing to leave, packing water, loading weapons, going over the route on the topo map, when we heard it. Not the clicking, something worse. Screaming, distant, carried on the morning air through the ventilation gap. Human screaming, ragged and sustained, coming from the south, from below the ridge, from the direction of Calvary. It lasted 4 minutes. I know because I timed it. 4 minutes of sound that rose and fell and rose again, multiple voices overlapping. And then it stopped in a way that was worse than the screaming itself, suddenly, completely, as if someone had cut a wire. Lily was awake. She stood in the tunnel, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the barricade, and the look on her face was something no child should ever wear. Nora pulled her close and turned her away from the wall. Dean and I looked at each other. Neither of us moved toward the gate. "That was from the south," he said. "From town. The fire station is south." I didn't answer. I went to the ventilation gap and pressed my ear against the wire mesh. The forest beyond was silent again. That terrible, inverted silence that meant everything natural had fled or died. Then I heard the clicking. Not one source, many. A chorus, faint but unmistakable, rippling through the trees like insect sound, like something pretending to be nature. "They're in the forest," I said. "Multiple, between us and the trucks." Dean came to the gap. He listened. His face went through a sequence of expressions I'd never seen on him before: recognition, calculation, then something that might have been surrender. "The CB," he said. "Frank." I took the handheld radio we'd brought back from the truck. It was short range, but it might reach on the right frequency. I keyed the mic. Frank Hadley, this is Ethan Marsh. Do you copy?" Static. "Frank, if you can hear me, respond." Nothing. Just the electronic whisper of empty air. Dean took the radio from my hand. He tried twice more. The radio offered nothing but static and the faint undertone of a world that had moved past the need for communication. We never heard from Frank Hadley again. I sealed the ventilation gap that afternoon. Not permanently, we still needed airflow, but I rigged a secondary cover. A thick wool blanket suspended over the mesh that could be lowered to muffle sound transmission. The clicking outside was intermittent. It came in waves, as if the infected moved through the forest in patterns we couldn't predict. Sometimes there were minutes of silence. Sometimes the clicking was close enough to the portal that the sound penetrated even through the stone wall and the blanket, reaching us at our camp as a faint, arrhythmic tapping. My mother heard it. She sat on her cot with her hands folded and her eyes closed, and she said, "Those woodpeckers are very persistent." Sandra looked at me. I looked at Nora. Nobody corrected her. The confinement was beginning to work on us in ways I hadn't anticipated. The tunnel was spacious by shelter standards. 1,000 usable feet of passage wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, with alcoves for storage and a camp area that accommodated 7 sleeping positions with room to move. But it was dark. Relentlessly, absolutely dark, beyond the reach of our lanterns. And the darkness had weight. It pressed inward from both ends of the tunnel, from the sealed entrance, and from the collapsed terminus, and it flattened time. Hours became elastic. Without sunlight, without the rhythmic cues of dawn and dusk, our bodies lost their temporal anchoring. I found myself checking my watch compulsively, not because I needed to know the time, but because the time was the only evidence that the world outside still turned. Dean developed insomnia. He'd sit at the barricade watch for 12, 14 hours, refusing relief, his eyes fixed on the gate as if willpower alone could hold it. Sandra noticed and said nothing for 2 days. On Saturday evening, she walked to the barricade, stood in front of Dean, and said, "You need to sleep or you need to eat. Pick one. You're not doing this." "Doing what?" "Turning into a wall. You're not a wall. You're a person with a son who needs to see you being a person, not a weapon." Dean stared at her. Then he put down the shotgun, stood up, and walked to Marcus. He sat beside his son and put his arm around him. And Marcus leaned into it with a relief so visible, it made my throat close. That night, Nora and I sat together at the water station. The lantern was low, barely illuminating our faces. She held a cup of filtered water in both hands, not drinking, just holding it for the warmth. "I can't reach them," she said. Her parents. I'd known this was coming. "The phones have no signal. The radio gets nothing from Richmond. The news..." She stopped, breathed. "The news said military operations in the greater Richmond area. What does that mean? Operations against what? The infected? Or are they..." She couldn't finish. "I don't know. I keep thinking about my mother standing at the kitchen door. You know how she stands there when she's waiting for us to arrive? With her hand on the frame and that look on her face, like she's been waiting hours, even if we're right on time." "I know. She's standing at that door right now, Ethan. And no one is coming." There was nothing I could say that wouldn't be either a lie or a cruelty. So I sat with her in the thin light and held her hand and let the silence be what it was, a space where grief could exist without being managed or explained. After a while, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a single efficient motion, and said, "We need to start rationing harder. If we're going to stay past 3 weeks, we need to cut portions by a third." The pivot from grief to logistics was so sharp it could have drawn blood. But that was Nora. That was how she survived, by turning pain into planning, by channeling what she couldn't control into what she could. "I'll talk to Sandra," I said. "I already did," she agrees. Of course she did. The 2 women who managed our survival had already solved the problem, while the rest of us were still processing the question. Sunday, day 6. The clicking outside the tunnel had become constant. Not loud, if anything, it had settled into a kind of ambient frequency, a white noise of menace. But its persistence changed the psychological equation. We were no longer waiting for the infected to arrive. They were here. They were in the forest, around us, between us and our vehicles, between us and the world. We were encircled. Marcus was the first to articulate what I'd been calculating privately. He found me at the supply alcove, doing the daily inventory, and he stood there until I noticed him. "Uncle Ethan?" "Yeah?" "I've been counting. The food. Even with the cuts Aunt Nora made, we have 17 days. Maybe 19 if we cut more." I stopped counting cans. "You've been tracking the supply numbers?" "Mom's chart is right there on the wall. It's not hard to read." 13 years old, and he was running caloric projections in his head. Dean's steadiness, Sandra's pragmatism. The combination had produced a child who processed crisis through mathematics. "You're right," I said. 17 to 19 days at current rationing. "And then?" "Then someone goes out for more." "Into that?" He tilted his head toward the barricade, toward the clicking. "Yes." He absorbed this without visible reaction. Then, "I want to learn to use a gun." "Marcus, I'm not asking to go outside. I'm asking to be useful if something gets inside." I looked at this boy, tall, serious, his mother's dark eyes holding a steadiness that no 13-year-old should need, and I thought about my own daughter, 2 years younger, sleeping 30 feet away. If I taught Marcus to shoot, I was acknowledging that our defenses might fail. If I didn't, I was prioritizing my own comfort over his survival. "I'll talk to your parents." Dean said yes immediately. Sandra said no, then yes, then asked to be present. We set up a lesson that afternoon using the pistol, unloaded, in the tunnel's collapsed end where the sound wouldn't carry to the barricade. I showed him grip, stance, sight alignment, trigger discipline. He listened with fierce concentration. When I finally loaded the magazine and let him fire a single round into the packed earth of the collapse, the sound was enormous, a concussive blast that rolled through the tunnel like thunder and brought everyone running. "1 round," I told them. "Training." Sandra's face was a battleground. Dean nodded once. Lily clapped her hands over her ears and looked betrayed. My mother said, "Is someone hunting?" That single round was a line crossed. The sound of a gunshot in a sealed tunnel absorbed by stone was the loudest thing any of us had produced since we'd arrived. We hadn't meant to be loud. We'd been living in whispers and soft footsteps, conditioning ourselves to smallness. The gunshot was a reminder that violence lived inside the tunnel too, coiled and waiting. There was no more target practice. But Marcus carried the knowledge in his posture. And I saw him glance at the pistol's location, always on my hip or on the shelf beside my sleeping bag, with an awareness that was both reassuring and heartbreaking. Monday came without distinction. Day 7. I was at the barricade on morning watch when I heard something new. Not the clicking, not the forest silence. A rhythmic impact against the outer wall. Soft, patient, repeated. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. I pressed my ear to the stone. The sound was clearer, something striking the barricade from the outside. Not with force, not trying to break through. Testing. Thud, pause, thud. Like a hand placed flat against stone, pressing, then withdrawing. I motioned for Dean. He came silently, put his ear beside mine. We listened together. The thudding continued for 11 minutes, then stopped. In the silence that followed, the clicking resumed, but closer now. Right at the wall. "They know we're here," Dean whispered. I didn't argue. The ventilation gap, even with the blanket covering it, allowed sound to pass in both directions. Our footsteps, our voices, the clatter of daily living. The mountain muffled most of it, but we weren't silent. We were a pocket of human noise in a landscape that had gone quiet. And the infected had found us the way a predator finds warmth in winter. I called a meeting. All adults. Lily and Marcus were asked to stay at camp with my mother. "They're at the wall," I said. "At least one, maybe more. They're not trying to break through, not yet. But they're aware of us." "What does that change?" Sandra asked. "Everything. If they know we're here, they'll keep coming. We've seen them congregate around sound. Frank said that before we lost contact. If enough of them gather at the entrance." "The barricade holds," Dean said. "The barricade holds against pushing, against testing. But we don't know the upper limit. We don't know what happens when there are 50 of them pressing against 6 feet of stone and mud." "So we go quieter," Nora said. "We go silent, as close to it as we can. No more camp stove, the gas hiss carries. Cold meals only. Whisper protocol inside the entire tunnel. Felt pads on the lanterns so they don't clank when we move them. And the generator doesn't run. Period." "The radio?" The radio is useless if we're dead, Dean. The whisper protocol changed life inside the tunnel more than any single decision we'd made. Sound had been our last tether to normality, the ability to speak, to laugh occasionally, to hear Lily ask a question in a full voice, to listen to my mother hum her unrecognizable songs. Removing that tether was like removing color from a painting. Everything still functioned, but the living quality drained away. Lily adapted quickly. Children are adaptable in ways that adults are not. They bend where we break. She and Marcus developed a system of hand signals for common communications, supplementing the whispered words with gestures that grew more elaborate as the days compressed. My mother did not adapt. The whisper protocol confused her. She'd start to speak at normal volume, and someone would touch her arm, shush her gently, and she'd look hurt and withdraw. Within 2 days, she stopped trying to speak at all. She sat on her cot or in her chair and watched us move through our silent routines with the expression of someone who has been told the rules of a game but can't understand why anyone is playing. I sat with her when I could. I held her hand and whispered stories about Lily, about Dean when he was young, about my father. She'd smile sometimes, and sometimes she'd say, "Speak up, Ethan, I can't hear you." And the look of gentle confusion on her face was more painful than anything the clicking outside could produce. Tuesday, day 8. 1 week since we sealed ourselves inside. I was asleep, real sleep, not the half-conscious drift that passed for rest when Nora shook my shoulder. Her grip was iron. Her whisper was barely a breath. The wall. I heard it immediately. The thudding was back, but it had multiplied. Not one point of contact, many. A distributed percussion across the face of the barricade, overlapping and arrhythmic, as if dozens of hands were pressing and releasing against the stone. Dean was already at the barricade, shotgun aimed at the gate. Sandra stood behind him with a lantern dimmed to its lowest setting. The sound was immense up close, not loud exactly, but pervasive. The wall vibrated faintly with each impact. Small trickles of dirt cascaded from the gaps between stones. "How many?" I whispered. "I counted at least 20 distinct impact points," Dean said. "Could be more. They're pressing from the bottom of the wall to about head height." I put my hand on the stone. I could feel them, the transmitted force of bodies against the other side, patient and relentless. The mud mortar between the stones was intact, but I watched a hairline crack appear in the packed earth near the base. Just a thread, barely visible, but it was new. "We need to shore up the base," I said. Dean and I worked in near darkness, moving by feel as much as sight. We pulled reserve stone from the alcove and packed it against the barricade's inner face, wedging it tight, adding mass. Sandra mixed mud from earth and water and pressed it into the cracks. We worked for 3 hours, and the thudding continued the entire time. Steady, mechanical, indifferent to our efforts. At some point during the shoring, Marcus appeared. He didn't ask permission. He just started carrying stones, moving with the silence he'd learned, placing them where Dean indicated. 13 years old, in the dark, reinforcing a wall against things that wanted to eat him. I saw Dean look at his son and see something he wasn't ready to see, not the child he'd brought here, but the person the tunnel was making. By dawn, a dawn we couldn't see, but our watches promised, the thudding slowed, diminished, stopped. The clicking retreated, pulling away from the portal like a tide going out. "Daylight pushes them back," Nora said. She'd been observing the pattern since Wednesday. "They're more active at night. During the day, they disperse. Not far, they stay in the forest, but they pull away from concentrated positions." "Why?" I don't know. Light sensitivity? Circadian disruption from the neurological damage? Whatever it is, it gives us a window. A few hours each day when the pressure on the barricade drops. That window became our lifeline. Between roughly 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, the hours of strongest daylight filtering through the forest canopy, the infected scattered enough that the area immediately outside the portal was navigable. Not safe, never safe, but navigable. I made a decision. I'm going out, I said. During the day window, down to the trucks for food, the supplies we left behind because we couldn't carry them. Alone? Nora asked. 2 people make more noise than 1, and I'm faster alone. Ethan, we have 15 days of food, maybe less if the rations are too thin and people start getting weak. I can reach the trucks in 20 minutes, grab what's left, and be back before the window closes. And if you don't come back? The question hung in the tunnel air. I looked at Nora, at Lily sleeping behind her, at Dean and Sandra and Marcus and my mother. 7 people, in a stone tube depending on 1 person, to walk through a forest full of monsters and come back carrying canned goods. Then Dean takes over. You have the barricade, you have the schedule, you have the water supply. You survive. Nora held my gaze for a long time. Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She pressed it into my hand. My parents' address. If somehow, after all this, if you ever get to Richmond. I put the paper in my chest pocket without unfolding it. I didn't need to read it. I'd been to their house 100 times. At 10 in the morning, Dean and I opened the gate. The daylight was thin, filtered through cloud cover and canopy. The forest beyond the portal looked exactly as it always had, a green, wet, indifferent. But I knew what lived in it now. I moved fast. Down the trail, through the hollow empty, no figures to the trucks. Both vehicles were undisturbed, but covered in a fine layer of organic debris. Leaves, pollen, something pale and granular I didn't examine closely. I opened Dean's truck bed and loaded my pack with canned food, a box of ammunition, 2 emergency blankets, and a bag of rice that had split along one seam. I sealed the rice bag with duct tape. I was moving back toward the trail when I heard the clicking. Not behind me, ahead, between me and the tunnel. I froze. The sound was coming from the tree line to the left of the trail, maybe 30 yards out. One source stationary, the same standing and waiting posture I'd seen on Wednesday. I couldn't see it through the undergrowth, but I could hear it. And the sound was different up close, wetter, more organic, like cartilage flexing. I had 2 choices: wait and hope it moved, or detour right through denser forest, adding 10 minutes and the risk of encountering more. I went right. I moved through the undergrowth as quietly as a man carrying 40 pounds of supplies can move, placing each foot on bare earth, avoiding sticks, avoiding leaves. The clicking continued to my left, unchanging. I circled wide, reconnected with the trail 50 yards above the obstruction, and climbed to the portal. Dean was at the gate. He pulled me inside and barred it. I dropped the pack and sat against the wall, breathing. 1, I said. On the trail, standing. Same as before? Same. But Dean, the clicking is different up close. It's not random. There's a pattern to it. A rhythm. Communication? I don't know. Maybe. Or echolocation. Like bats. The supplies I'd brought back added 4 days to our timeline. 21 days total if the rationing held. 21 days in a tunnel that was being tested every night by an increasing number of infected, with a barricade that cracked under pressure. and 7 people losing pieces of themselves to the darkness and the silence. 21 days. I wrote the number in my notebook and stared at it until it stopped meaning anything. The second week was a war of erosion. Every night, the thudding returned. Every night, it was slightly louder, slightly more distributed across the barricade face. Every morning, Dean and I inspected the wall for new cracks, new shifts, new evidence that the weight of what pressed against us was growing. On day 10, a stone in the upper section dislodged. It didn't fall inward, the backing held it, but it shifted 2 inches, creating a gap that admitted a thread of outside air. Through that gap, the clicking entered the tunnel unfiltered for the first time. Raw, close. The sound of jaws working, fast and wet. A mechanical hunger that had no analog in the natural world. Lily heard it. She pressed her hands over her ears and whispered, with the contained terror of a child who has learned not to scream, "Make it stop." I packed the gap with stone and mud. It held. But the sound stayed in my head and all our heads long after the physical gap was sealed. My mother's condition accelerated. By day 11, she was losing hours at a time, slipping into conversations with people who weren't present, calling me Ray, calling Lily by my sister's name, my sister who died at birth, 38 years ago, a name I hadn't heard spoken since my father's funeral. The darkness and disorientation were collapsing her remaining cognitive architecture. Nora managed her medications with meticulous care. But the medications were designed for a woman living in a well-lit facility with routine, socialization, and professional monitoring. Not for a woman in a cave. On day 12, my mother stood up from her cot at 2 a.m, walked to the barricade, and began speaking to the wall in a clear, loud voice. "Ray, Ray, is that you? Open the door, Ray. It's cold out here." The tunnel erupted. Dean grabbed his shotgun. Sandra caught Marcus's arm. Nora ran for my mother. I reached her first. Mom, come away from the wall." "Ray's outside. I can hear him knocking." The thudding. She was hearing the thudding and translating it through her broken memory into something she could understand. Her dead husband, knocking to come in. "That's not Dad, Mom. Come back to bed." "Don't be silly, Ethan. I know your father's knock." I took her arm. She resisted gently, the way she always resisted things she didn't understand, with confusion rather than force. Nora appeared at her other side, and together we guided her back to her cot. She went, still talking, still insisting that Ray was outside, that we needed to let him in, that he'd catch cold. The incident lasted 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, my mother had spoken at full volume, her words carrying through the tunnel and out the ventilation gap into the night forest. Within seconds of her first sentence, the thudding on the barricade intensified dramatically, not gradually, not incrementally, but all at once, as if every infected in earshot had locked onto her voice like a signal. The wall shook. Mud rained from the joints. A second stone shifted. Dean braced himself against the inner face, his shoulder against the cold rock, his boots sliding on the tunnel floor. And I could see the tendons in his neck straining as the wall transmitted the force of bodies on the other side. It lasted 9 minutes, the longest 9 minutes of my life. Then, like before, it subsided. The clicking continued, but the pressure withdrew. Dawn was approaching. The pattern held. Dean sat on the floor with his back against the barricade. His face was gray. "That wall won't take another night like that," he said. "I know." "Ethan, I'm not speaking hypothetically. The base is compromised. The stones are shifting. Another sustained push, and the lower section fails. Once the lower section fails, the whole thing comes down. I looked at my mother, asleep now on her cot, her face peaceful, dreaming of a husband who was never coming home. She'd almost killed us. Not through malice, not through negligence. Through the simple, devastating mechanism of a mind that could no longer distinguish between the living and the dead, between safety and danger, between a wall that protected and a door that should be opened. Sandra found me at the water station. She stood in front of me and said nothing for a long time. Then, "You know what I'm going to say." "Yeah." "Your mother can't stay at the barricade end of the tunnel. She can't be anywhere near the wall. Her voice, I know what her voice does." "Then you know she needs to be at the back, at the collapsed end, far enough that even at full volume, the sound won't reach the gap. That's 300 feet from camp, alone, in the dark. I'll go with her. I'll move my bedding and stay with her. But she cannot be near that wall again." Sandra was right. Tactically, emotionally, practically right. And the fact that she volunteered to go with my mother to isolate herself at the dead end of a tunnel, to keep an old woman's confusion from killing them all, was either the most generous or the most strategic thing anyone had done since we sealed the entrance. "Sandra, don't thank me. I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it for Marcus." She moved my mother that afternoon, gently, with warm blankets and a lantern, and a quiet explanation that they were going to have their own private camp. Just the two of them, a girls' retreat. My mother accepted this with the same trusting compliance she'd shown since Lewisburg. And I watched her shuffle down the tunnel into the deeper dark with Sandra at her elbow. And something in my chest broke along a fault line I didn't know existed. Day 13. The barricade was failing. Dean's assessment had been precise. The base stones were shifting outward, separated by the nightly pressure, the mud mortar crumbling between them. We reinforced constantly, but reinforcement required materials, and we'd stripped the tunnel of every usable stone. The supply of earth for mortar was running low. We were patching a dam with diminishing resources while the water rose. I made a decision I'd been avoiding since day 6. We collapsed the entrance. Dean stared at me. "What?" "The tunnel has a natural collapse at the far end. The stone is sandstone, it fractures along bedding planes. The portal's the same geology. If we can bring down enough material above the entrance, we bury the barricade under tons of rock. Nothing gets through. Nothing. Nothing gets out either. I know. Ethan, if we collapse the entrance, we're sealed in. Permanently. No supply runs, no exit. We live on what we have until... Until what? We dig out, get rescued. I don't know, Dean. But I know that wall fails in the next 48 hours. When it fails, they come in. All of them. Every single one that's been pressing against that stone for the past week. And behind them, whatever else is in that forest." Dean ran his hands through his hair. He looked at the barricade, at the visible damage, the cracks, the bulging at the base, the stones that had shifted enough to admit daylight through gaps that hadn't existed yesterday. "How?" he asked. "The sandstone above the portal is fractured already. I noted it in my original survey. There's a natural weakness in the ceiling just inside the entrance. If we weaken it further, drill into the fracture lines, set an explosive charge. We don't have explosives. We have the generator fuel, gasoline vapor in a confined space, ignited. That's not an explosive. That's a bomb, and we'd be inside the blast radius. Not if we set it from deep enough in the tunnel. I need a long fuse. Something slow burning. I can rig a candle wick or a fuel-soaked rope." Dean was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything except the core calculation. We'd need to move everyone to the back, past the curve, the blast pressure in a confined tube. I know. That's why the fuse has to be long enough to give us time. And if the collapse is too much? If it cascades past the portal? The first 300 feet of tunnel are stone-lined. Original construction, hand-cut blocks. It's the strongest section. The collapse should stop where the stone lining begins. Should. We looked at each other. Two brothers in a mountain, weighing the mechanics of burying themselves alive against the certainty of being overrun. It was not a decision that any survival manual prepares you for. It was not a decision that any rational assessment could justify. But we were past rationality. We were in the territory where survival calculus meets something older and more desperate, the animal conviction that sealed in is better than torn apart. Tonight, I said. Before the thudding starts, we set it, we light it, we run. I told Nora in the second alcove. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The air. The drainage channel. It runs the full length of the tunnel. Wherever it emerges on the other side of the collapse. There's airflow, I felt it during my original survey. It'll be limited, but the tunnel's volume is large. We'll have enough air for weeks, maybe longer. Maybe. Yes, maybe." She pressed her palms together, fingers to her lips, the way she did when she was processing something that exceeded her capacity for organized response. Food, water, air, in that order of depletion. We have the water supply from the drainage channel. We have 16 days of food, maybe more. Air is the uncertainty. And beyond 16 days? I don't have an answer for that. Then I need to accept that. Yes. She lowered her hands. Okay. Okay? Ethan, you found this tunnel. You brought us here. You built that wall. Every decision you've made has kept us alive 7 days longer than we would have survived in our house. If you say we collapse the entrance, I trust you. The weight of that trust was heavier than every stone I'd carried. We spent the afternoon preparing. Dean rigged the charge a sealed container of gasoline positioned at the natural fracture point in the ceiling, 10 feet inside the portal. He drilled into the sandstone above it, weakening the bedding planes, creating a cascade path. I prepared the fuse, a length of cotton rope soaked in kerosene, running from the charge back to the stone lining, roughly 40 feet. 40 feet. At a slow burn rate, that gave us approximately 3 minutes. We moved everyone past the curve. Sandra had already relocated my mother to the far end. Marcus and Lily were positioned at the midpoint, instructed to lie flat with their heads away from the entrance and their ears covered. Nora was with them, holding Lily against her body. Dean and I stood at the fuse point. The tunnel behind us was dark. The tunnel ahead, the last 40 feet of the barricade section, was lit by a single lantern near the charge. "Once I light this," Dean said, "I'm going to run. You should be running before me." "Together." He looked at me. "Together, yeah." I struck the match. The flame was the brightest thing in the world. I touched it to the rope, and the kerosene caught with a soft whoosh, a blue flame racing along the cotton toward the portal. We ran. The explosion was not what I expected. It was not a sharp detonation, but a deep, structural concussion, a sound felt more than heard. A pressure wave that hit my back and threw me forward into the dark. Behind me, the tunnel roared. Stone broke. The ceiling surrendered to gravity. The sound was geological, ancient, and absolute, the mountain closing its mouth. Then silence. Complete. The tunnel shook with settling vibrations, dust filling the air in a choking cloud, and then even the vibrations stopped. I was on the ground. Dean was beside me, coughing. I found his arm, gripped it. "You good?" Yeah, I'm good." We stood up. My headlamp was gone, lost in the blast. Dean found his lantern. He turned it on. Behind us, the tunnel curved away into darkness, toward our camp, our families, our lives. Ahead of us, the tunnel no longer existed. The collapse had brought down the ceiling in a solid mass of fractured sandstone, filling the passage from floor to ceiling in an impenetrable wall of rubble. No light came through. No sound came through. The clicking was gone. We stood there, two men breathing dust, staring at the end of the world. Then Dean laughed. One short, sharp bark of laughter that bounced off the stone walls and died. "Well," he said, "we're in." The days after the collapse were the quietest any of us had ever lived. Without the clicking, without the thudding, without the constant subliminal pressure of knowing that something hungry waited on the other side of a failing wall, the tunnel became something it hadn't been before. Not safe. The air concern was real. The food concern was real. The question of how long we could survive in a sealed stone tube was terrifyingly real. But quiet. Genuinely, completely quiet, in a way that allowed the mind to rest for the first time in 2 weeks. My mother improved. Not her cognition, the dementia continued its patient work, but her agitation diminished. Without the thudding that she interpreted as her dead husband's knock, she slept better, spoke more coherently during her waking hours, and stopped trying to go to the wall. Sandra reported that she was eating well and asking about Lily. "She wants to play cards," Sandra said. "She keeps asking if Lily knows gin rummy." "Lily knows gin rummy," I said. "I taught her last Christmas." "Then send her back here. Your mother needs something to do that isn't listening to the dark." Lily went. She spent 3 hours a day with her grandmother in the back section, playing cards by lantern light. And the sound of their whispered conversation, they maintained the protocol, even without the threat. Because the habit had become instinct, was the closest thing to normalcy we had. Dean and I assessed our situation with the precision of men who understood that imprecision meant death. Air. The drainage channel continued to provide faint but measurable airflow. I held a candle flame over the channel and watched it flicker consistently, proof that air was moving from somewhere beyond the collapse. The tunnel's volume was large enough that carbon dioxide buildup would be slow. Nora estimated we had weeks, possibly months, before air quality became critical, depending on the flow rate. Water. The drainage channel still ran. The collapse hadn't interrupted the water source, which came from within the mountain itself, seepage through the sandstone, collecting in the channel and running toward what used to be the entrance. With the entrance sealed, the water pooled at the collapse point, and we redirected it to our filtration system. Food. 14 days at current rationing. This was the hard number, the immovable wall that no amount of adaptation could circumvent. 14 days, Dean said. Then what? Then we dig. He looked at the collapse. Hundreds of tons of broken sandstone, compressed by gravity, packed by its own weight. Dig through that? Not through, around. Or find another way. There may be fissures in the tunnel walls, natural passages through the karst. We haven't explored the full geology. It was hope constructed from limestone and desperation. But hope was what we had, and I wasn't prepared to relinquish it. On day 15, I began a systematic survey of the tunnel walls. I worked alone, moving inch by inch along the sandstone surface, tapping with a hammer, listening for hollows. The geology was complex layers of sandstone and shale, interbedded with thin limestone horizons. Karst features were possible in the limestone layers. If a solution cavity existed, a natural void dissolved by water over millions of years, it might connect to another passage, another way through the mountain. I found it on day 17. Not a passage, a sound. Deep in the wall at the curve point, where the tunnel turned to the southeast, my hammer strikes returned a hollow ring. I pressed my ear to the stone and heard something I hadn't expected. Wind. Faint, intermittent, but unmistakable. Air moving through a rock. Dean and I began excavating. We used the hand tools, hammer, chisel, pry bar working in shifts, cutting into the sandstone wall at the point where the sound was strongest. The work was brutally slow, inches per hour. Rock dust in our lungs, in our eyes, in the food and water. But behind each inch of stone, the sound of wind grew stronger. On day 19, the chisel broke through into open air. The cavity was narrow, barely 2 feet wide, but it extended beyond the reach of our lantern light. Cool air flowed from it steadily, carrying the smell of earth and something else. Something green, growing things. I squeezed into the fissure. It angled upward, tightening and widening unpredictably, but trending toward the surface. I climbed 30 feet through absolute darkness, my shoulders scraping stone on both sides, before the fissure opened enough to stand. Above me, impossibly, a seam of gray light. I climbed toward it. The light grew. The air warmed. The smell of forest intensified until it was overwhelming pine, decay, rain, the vast organic complexity of a living world. I emerged on the mountainside. A crack in the rock face, hidden by rhododendron, opening onto a steep slope 200 feet above the tunnel entrance. The sky was overcast. The trees dripped with recent rain. Below me, through the canopy, I could see the collapsed portal, a mass of broken stone spilling from the mountainside like a wound. No clicking, no figures in the trees, just the forest, breathing. I stood on the mountain and I cried, not from relief, not from exhaustion, from the sheer, crushing weight of what I'd done. Sealed my family in a mountain, collapsed the door, spent 19 days in darkness with 7 people balanced on the edge of annihilation and the absurd, impossible discovery that the mountain had offered another way out. I went back in through the fissure. I told them. I watched the information move through each face. Dean's cautious assessment, Sandra's sharp calculation, Nora's measured relief, Marcus's quiet nod, Lily's explosive whispered joy, my mother's gentle confusion. "We can get out?" my mother asked. "Yes, Mom, we can get out." "Oh, good. I need to water my garden." Her garden, in Lewisburg, in a house she'd never see again, in a town that no longer existed as she remembered it. But the garden was real to her, and the need to tend it was real. And in that moment, her delusion was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. We didn't leave immediately. The fissure was narrow and the climb was difficult. My mother couldn't make it without help. We spent 2 days widening the tightest sections, rigging a rope system, preparing for the ascent. Dean and I made scouting trips to the surface, brief, careful, armed, and confirmed that the immediate area was clear. The infected were still in the forest. We heard clicking in the distance. But the ridgeline above the tunnel was exposed rock and thin soil, unfavorable terrain. And the infected seemed to concentrate in the hollows and valleys where the canopy was dense. On day 21, we climbed out. All 7 of us. My mother went on a sling that Dean and Marcus hauled from above while Sandra guided from below. Lily climbed with a rope around her waist and Nora's hands steadying her feet. I went last, pulling our remaining supplies in a pack. We stood on the mountain in the rain. 7 people, hollow-eyed and filthy, blinking in the gray daylight like something born from the stone. Below us, the world we'd known was gone. Above us, the ridgeline extended north into wilderness, uncharted, unpopulated, and possibly survivable. Chaitan, Dean looked north. Mountains go a long way. They do. People up there. There used to be. Fire lookouts, hunting camps, old homesteads. Not much. Enough, maybe. Sandra adjusted Marcus's pack. Nora held Lily's hand. My mother stood between Dean and me, one hand on each of our arms, looking at the forest with an expression that might have been wonder or might have been the dementia's merciful erasure of context. "Which way?" Dean asked. I looked at my family, at the people I'd sealed in a mountain and led through stone and brought back into the light. They were thinner, quieter, harder. They were alive. "Up," I said. "We go up." There is no recording of what happened in that tunnel. No camera, no journal, no evidence beyond the memories of 7 people who lived it. I'm telling you now because memory is the only archive the world has left. And if I don't speak it, it becomes something that happened to no one. The tunnel is still there, sealed at one end by our collapse, open at the other through a fissure that the mountain kept hidden for 100 million years. Sometimes I think about that, the patience of geology. The way stone holds its secrets until someone is desperate enough to listen for them. We found shelter on the ridge. Then we found others. Then we built something that I will not call a community because the word is too clean for what survival makes of people living together. But we built it, and it held. And my daughter grew up in it, and my mother died in it, peacefully, on a spring morning, calling for my father. I think about the barricade, the wall Dean and I built from mud and stone and terror. It held long enough. That's all you can ask of a wall, that it holds long enough for the people behind it to find another way. The clicking is still out there. In the valleys, in the hollows, in the dark places where the canopy presses down and the light doesn't reach. We hear it sometimes, carried on the wind. It doesn't freeze me anymore. It did once. In the tunnel, in the dark, on the worst nights, it froze me to the bone. But that was before I understood something the mountain taught me. You don't survive by keeping the world out. You survive by finding the crack in the rock, the seam of air, the improbable passage that leads you back to the light. And then you climb. You climb,